Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here for the National Zoning Atlas's latest presentation, this time about the zoning in and around Portland, Maine. I'd like to start the presentation by thanking our partners, who include Grow Smart Maine and the Maine Department of Economic and Community Development, which provided funding for a portion of the work that you'll be hearing about today. So thanks to both of our state partners. We really appreciate the support, and we look forward to the many ways that these partners and others will use the data that we described today. I'm Sarah Bronin, the founder and president of the National Zoning Atlas, and I'm joined today by a few speakers. A guest speaker, Eleanor Snyder, who has been leading the steering committee on the ground in Maine in partnership with Grow Smart Maine and many other institutions, who will be discussing for a few minutes the background information that might be important for folks to understand about Maine's housing crisis and zoning in Maine. I'll also be joined by two of our senior analysts, Jeff Conkle, who worked in this area, as well as Coral Troxel, again, also worked in this area, and as part of our senior team, have lots of experience, and so we'll be very interested to answer your questions. On that note, I will invite you, if you do have questions, to put them in the Q&A feature in Zoom. And I am going to turn it over to Eleanor, who's going to tell us a bit about background in Maine. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you to the national team. So, I think as many of us know, there's a housing crisis across the country, and Maine is no different. We've been trending in this direction for some time now, but the COVID-19 pandemic really exacerbated the crisis and has led us to where we are today. A 2023 State of Maine Housing Production Needs Study actually identified that the state needs an additional of 84,000 homes by 2030 to meet current and future needs and to support Maine businesses and communities. Next slide, please. Um, so a little bit of history. Because as a result of this crisis, folks in the legislature have really taken action to try to identify solutions. The first step, most recently, was the 2021 Commission to increase housing opportunities in Maine. And as a result of that, there was this bill passed, LD 2003, that did many things, but for our purposes, it enabled greater housing density, particularly in locally designated growth areas. Importantly, Maine does not maintain a statewide database of local zoning ordinances or growth areas. So the lack of statewide zoning data makes it difficult to predict or track the impact of this bill. And we really believe that the Maine Zoning Atlas is responding to this need for state level zoning data while still honoring Maine's tradition of local control. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into depth, but there have been many previous efforts to map regional parts of the state before. So this is really aligned with the thinking of many folks on the ground here in Maine. Next slide, please. So the Atlas, and I think folks will speak more about this in a little bit, but the Atlas opens unprecedented opportunities for sophisticated spatial and policy analysis. And here are just some of the research questions we can now explore with better data. Next slide, please. Maine's zoning context is different for a number of reasons. Infrastructure constraints include septic systems, wells, and road access limitations in many areas require careful site assessment. The rural scale with working waterfronts, lakes, forests, and seasonal dynamics shape development patterns in Maine. And shoreline protections intersect with development potential, requiring integrated overlay analysis. Next slide, please. Maine has a long tradition of local control, but that has resulted in few staffing resources at the local level. It really leaves wide interpretive latitude given to local code enforcement and zoning officers. Amending the zoning code in areas with town meeting environments is incredibly hard. It really only gives you one or two opportunities a year to make changes to the zoning text. Next slide, please. I won't go too deeply into the next several slides here, but zoning in Maine goes way back to 1925 and probably a little bit before, where we've had efforts to control land use. Next slide, please. In 1955, the state passed legislation that enabled two or more municipalities to share the cost of creating a regional comprehensive development plan. This is an example from the greater Portland region in the 60s. Next map, please. So you'll see that this, in 66, the state DECD distributed guidance so that regional planning commissions could help their municipalities and communities adopt consistent statewide zoning. Next slide, please. The 70s state zoning reforms addressed some statewide issues that were not being regulated by local ordinances, as more than half of the towns in Maine did not have any zoning at the time. Even where communities did have zoning, there was often significant variation from one town to the next, so there was a need for more coordination. Next slide, please. The 1988 Growth Management Act was a huge step forward, but aside from a couple of amendments to that, we really haven't made significant changes to our growth management plan in about 40 years. The key thing to take away here is that this complex and fragmented history that we are confronted with, it leaves us with several data pain points today. Next slide, please. So it's hard to comprehensively understand what communities are in need of housing and where. The consequences for housing development, uncertain project feasibility, missed development opportunities. The recently created Maine Redevelopment Land Bank Authority is doing great work and could really, that's one effort that could really benefit from a statewide look at the data and zoning data in Maine. Next slide, please. Together, this work enables smarter data-driven policy by helping us model the real impacts of zoning, such as parking, height, lot coverage, and inclusionary requirements, and understand how these rules interact with Maine's real estate submarkets. It also helps strengthen accountability and aligns development with climate, equity, and economic goals, while creating opportunities to pair the Atlas with other data sets and deepen collaboration across agencies and partners. I think we've been hungry for something like this in Maine for a long time, and I'm really excited that we're able to kick this off with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for providing that context. It's helpful to know how the National Zoning Atlas might be used on the ground and the kinds of policy questions that it can help inform. With that, we're going to turn to our part of the presentation, which includes 5 parts. So first, I'm going to talk about why we built the National Zoning Atlas in the first place. Jeff Conkle, who I mentioned at the beginning of the call, will describe how the Atlas is made. Coral, who's is going to tell us about how to use the Atlas. Then we're going to share some findings from the Tri-County Portland region. And then finally, I'm going to provide just a couple of examples of the National Zoning Atlas in action. As I said, we greatly encourage questions in the Q&A. Turning first to why we're building the National Zoning Atlas. As Elle pointed out, zoning is incredibly important. It, of course, has huge implications on whether we have affordable housing, how accessible it is, what type of economic growth that we experience. Zoning actually plays a pretty big role in transportation systems, and when you support transportation systems with appropriate zoning, they work better. When you don't, they work less well. Zoning has significant implications too on the environment. So large lot sprawl of the kind that we see in community after community in our work is not the kind of development that most environmentalists would think is a good idea. And yet those are the kinds of development patterns that we enshrine into law through zoning. Zoning can help influence climate preparedness. In a state like Maine with a long coastline, we see sea level rise as being a concern, and zoning in areas that are soon going to be inundated by rising waters is probably not the smartest idea. So thinking about climate resilience and preparedness is another aspect of zoning, and why we think it's a pretty important thing to understand. And then finally, access to food and public health generally, the amount of walking we do, the ability to grow our own food, to access fresh and healthy food. Zoning plays a pretty significant role in that too, one that we know is underexplored. Turning to the NZA mission, so because zoning is so important, and as Elle said, because it's been so hard to understand, due to lack of information, due to difficulty finding zoning codes. We've made it our mission to digitize, demystify, and democratize information about zoning. And we do that through our online map and our methodology to standardize information so that we can compare jurisdictions to each other. I love the third part of our mission, which is to democratize information about zoning, because people can't change zoning unless they understand what it says. So that part of our work, I think, is pretty important, and in fact motivated the first zoning atlas just a couple states away in Connecticut. Turning to where we are in our work, we've completed analysis of 15 states as well as the District of Columbia. Those states are incorporated into the image that you see here. And I just want to point out that we have worked in land covering over half of the country and more than half of the US population. And when you look at this map, you can see our coverage encompasses anything that is gray or purple. Where there is white, we have not worked. So anywhere that's purple are places we've confirmed have zoning. You can see California is entirely zoned. Arizona is virtually entirely zoned, versus places like Texas, which we haven't completed yet, but which you can already see just by all of that gray. It's a lot of it is unzoned. In Maine, we have only worked in the Portland area as well as Washington County. We are finding some patterns of zoning and unzoning that we are continuing to unravel, but you'll find the statistics on Portland area zoning, I think, pretty interesting, and they're coming up next. So when it comes to national progress, we're really proud that we've published information about 8,800 jurisdictions. We have found that about a third of them don't have zoning, and about 2/3 of them do have zoning. We're pushing 100,000 published zoning districts, and we've read over 1 million pages of code. And I think Jeff himself has probably read tens of thousands of pages of codes at this point. And Coral as well has digitized much of our so many jurisdictions, and she'll tell you exactly where she's worked, but across the country, including our area here. Coral, rather. National progress on the next slide. Again, as I mentioned, over half of US residents and half of total land. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, who's going to talk about how the National Zoning Atlas is made and the complicated efforts that go into creating our map.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Jeff Conkle, and I am a senior zoning analyst here at the NZA. In addition to the work here in Maine, I've also done zoning analysis in several other states, including Arizona, Alaska, Georgia, Michigan, California, and North Carolina. But today I'll walk you through how the atlas is built using zoning and geospatial analysis. We start our zoning analysis by identifying jurisdictions. These are the cities, towns, counties, and other places, such as plantations in the case of Maine, that have zoning authority. Within the 3-county Portland area, we found 67 individual jurisdictions that have the right to exercise zoning. The image on the right shows a small sample of them from York County. In the right-hand column, you can see the number of zoning districts for each jurisdiction. There's a pretty wide range in this part of Maine, from 8 in Buxton and Dayton to 35 in Biddeford. We generally find the more zoning districts there are in a town, the more complicated its zoning is. Once we've identified all the jurisdictions with zoning, the next step is to analyze their zoning districts. Here's a screenshot showing several of the 19 total zoning districts in Cape Elizabeth. On the left, you can see their names, and the middle column, we've classified them as either primarily residential, mixed with residential, or non-residential. The column on the right tells us whether the district is a base zoning district or an overlay zoning district. Most of Cape Elizabeth's districts are base districts, meaning they form the base or foundational zoning on the map. But also on the list, you'll notice a few overlay districts. Overlays are a unique type of district because they overlay or stack on top of one or more base districts to add extra regulations. Sometimes their rules are more strict, sometimes they're more flexible. It just depends on the purpose of the overlay. Once we confirm that a jurisdiction has zoning, we collect the 2 key components of a complete zoning code. These are the zoning text and the zoning map. Both are essential. The text tells us what's allowed, It has all of the definitions, uses, and development standards for each district, while the map shows us where those rules apply and how much land is allocated to each district. Here you can see the text and map used for our analysis of the town of Cornish. The town puts amendment dates on the cover page of the code. So here it looks like that it's amended its code about 16 times since 1993. The map is on the right. It's a little hard to read because it uses outlines rather than shading or coloring of the districts. It also uses blue lines to delineate both zoning districts and water features. As we'll discuss in a moment, we had several challenges in reading zoning maps in Maine. After collecting the map and code, NZA team members complete 2 work streams per jurisdiction, the text analysis and the geospatial analysis. The text analyst reviews the zoning ordinance and systematically logs key data points for every district using the NZA's standardized methodology. The geospatial analyst works with the zoning map, and depending on its format, they either digitize a static PDF map or they standardize existing GIS data. The results are then integrated into the NZA, producing the final data set you see in the atlas. And Coral is here to talk about that part.
Thanks, Jeff. My name is Coral, and I'm a senior geospatial analyst with the NZA. I've worked on multiple states around the country, including Texas, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Georgia, North Carolina, and Maine. Now we're going to walk through how to use the interactive map and get the most out of its features. If you'd like to follow along with me, head to zoningatlas.org/atlas. You can use a computer or mobile phone, but know the size of the map will be different for both. Let's dive into the interactive map. The map opens at the national scale, where the legend reflects the zone status of the jurisdictions in purple and gray. As Sarah said, the areas shown in white are yet to be analyzed and integrated into the NZA. If you have the tribal land and protected land layers on, you will also see these green and green-brown layers. These are most visible in the western states. In the Legend and Layer options box in the upper left corner, you have a few options to toggle on and off additional layers and features. You can also change the base map here. Now we'll use the Zoom and Filter box to explore a chosen geography. We selected Maine in the state dropdown, and the map zoomed to that state. We have the option to be even more specific with our geography selection. We selected Portland South Portland in the Metro Micropolitan Area dropdown. As Jeff will explain, we use the metropolitan area boundaries as defined by the census. Then we selected Cumberland County in the county dropdown, and lastly Portland in the jurisdiction dropdown. The map zoomed to the city of Portland and outlined the jurisdiction in black. Please note that you can only select one jurisdiction at a time. At this scale, notice that the legend updates to show zoning district type. Light purple areas indicate primarily residential districts, meaning these districts are primarily zoned for residential uses. Dark purple areas indicate mix with residential districts, meaning these districts allow a mix of residential and non-residential uses. Tan areas indicate non-residential districts, meaning residential as a primary use is prohibited. These are typically zones allowing industrial uses or other non-residential uses like airports or open space. Now let's apply filters to the map. The Show Me Where People Can Build box has options for quick filtering, like to show where missing middle housing or apartments are allowed. We toggled on the single-family homes filter, and you can see the map lost in color. Areas remain colored in when their criteria satisfies the selected filters. In other words, this means that you can build a single-family home anywhere the map is light or dark purple. In the lower right corner, the filtering results box calculates the zoned acres and number of districts that satisfy the filtering criteria. According to these results, 70% of zoned acres in Portland allow single-family housing by right. Note that the filtering results only shows calculations for the single selected jurisdiction. Using the Show Me Where People Can Build box, we can toggle the Apartments tab to view where 4 or more housing is allowed by right. The filtering results box shows that 58% of Portland's zoned acres allow for this type of housing. Now let's look at the Advanced Filters box. You should use it for selecting more specific filtering criteria, like whether one 2, 3, or 4+ unit housing is also subject to a public hearing, minimum parking requirements, or height caps, among other options. We've selected criteria where one-family housing is allowed as of right and has a minimum lot size requirement of 5,000 square feet. According to the filtering results, 44% of zoned acres in Portland satisfy this criteria. I'll pass it back to Jeff now.
Thank you, Coral. Now that we've covered how the atlas is built, let's talk about some of the things that are unique to Maine. One is that jurisdictions in Maine have the ability to approve customized zoning regulations. This is known as contract zoning. We saw quite a bit of this in our analysis. Contract zoning acts similarly to planned unit developments, if you're familiar with that planning concept, by allowing for a negotiated zoning process that results in specific guidelines for a particular piece of property. Also unique to Maine is shoreland zoning. These regulations dictate not just what can be built along the coast, but also near inland waterways. While we have seen similar environmentally based coastal regulations in other states, Maine gets a bit more complex. I'll let Coral talk more about those complications, especially as they relate to mapping.
Thanks, Jeff. Maine presented some unique challenges. We found that jurisdictions sometimes had multiple maps, one traditional zoning map and one shoreland zoning map. These maps often had different dates and were created by different entities. Locating the original data used to create these maps proved difficult as well. To accurately represent shoreland areas, a best practice is to have the original data, such as wetland and water body geometries. We found it challenging to determine the date and the source of these data files, and so did our best to recreate them according to the available maps. Another interesting fact about Maine was the variety of ways data was represented on the map. Sometimes the shoreland zoning was shown on the map as base districts, sometimes it was shown on the map as overlay districts. In addition, sometimes certain shoreland districts were displayed on the map broken out into their component parts, such as elevation contours and floodplain. Other times they were displayed as one combined geometry. I'll pass it back to Jeff now.
Coral, it's not just the contract zoning and shoreland issues that make zoning complicated in Maine. Many jurisdictions do not make their zoning codes or maps available online. In fact, after reaching out to all of the jurisdictions to request this information, we were still unable to obtain any zoning information for 17 of the 123 jurisdictions that we've evaluated so far across the state. Additionally, of the zoning codes that we do have, the average page length is 215, which is well above our national average of 180 pages. So as you can see, the lack of information and the complexity of the information can be problematic for someone trying to determine the zoning rights on a property. All right, so now that we've seen the map, let's take a look at how the Portland region zones. We use Census Bureau definitions for identifying metropolitan areas. These are also known as CBSAs, or core-based statistical areas. In the case of Portland, there are 3 counties that constitute the region: Cumberland, Sagadahoc, and York. Just to note that 100% of the jurisdictions in the 3-county region have zoning regulations. Across all 67 jurisdictions in the Portland region, we analyzed over 14,000 pages of zoning code. And for each of the 1,146 zoning districts across the region, we logged up to 200 distinct data points. Of all the land within the 3-county region, 88% of it is subject to zoning regulations. The remaining small percentages include protected land, such as parkland and wildlife preserves, while the rest is unzoned land, which includes rights-of-ways for things like roads. This figure shows how the 88% of zoned land is actually used. 92% of that allows for some form of residential development. And remember, that means any district that's either primarily residential or mixed with residential, which are the light and dark purple bars on this graph. So only about 8% of zoned land doesn't allow residential development. These are areas that are typically reserved for solely commercial, industrial, or conservation uses. Of note here is that 47% of land allowing a mixture of uses, which is the darker purple color, is quite a bit higher than we see in most regions. This stems from the fact that many jurisdictions in the Portland area have some type of mixed rural or general zoning district, rather than having an abundance of an urban mixed-use district. This housing unit allowances table shows how much residential land is available for different housing types. From left to right, 1, 2, 3, and 4 or more family housing. The dark blue shows the share of housing allowed by right, the light blue requires a public hearing, and gray is prohibited. It shows that across the region, 92% of residential land allows 1 unit per lot as of right, meaning single-family homes can be built almost anywhere. By right housing shrinks slightly for 2-family units down to 81%, then drops dramatically for 3 and 4 or more family residences, with just 23% of land allowing 4 or more development as of right. As a general rule, most residentially zoned land allows single-family homes to be built by right. However, multifamily allowances can vary greatly even among neighboring counties. For example, in Cumberland and York counties, about 25% of residentially zoned land allows 4 or more family development by right, whereas in Sagadahoc County, this number is just 8%. Now let's dig into the minimum lot sizes. This chart breaks down the share of land allowing single-family homes by the required size of their lots. Darker shades of green represent larger minimum lot sizes, and the lighter shades represent smaller ones. There's quite a bit of variation in the region's minimum lot sizes. The largest share of the donut tells us that 46% of land allowing one-family development requires a lot greater than 80,000 square feet. That's around 2 acres in size. Another large share of the donut is that 22% of single-family zoning requires at least an acre or so. These two total together mean that 68% of the region's single-family land requires an acre or more. Additionally, a large percentage, 23% in fact, of the land is subject to variable lot size requirements, as you can see by the hatch pattern on the chart. Broken down by county, you can see the donut on the very right that York County has the highest percentage of 2-acre minimum lot size at 62%. This is followed by Cumberland, shown on the left at 35%. Sagadahoc requirement is much less. That county's most prevalent lot size is instead the 1-acre requirement at 68%. Next up is a housing type that's become quite popular across the country, accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. Sometimes called granny flats or in-law suites, these are smaller secondary homes on the same lot as a single-family home. ADU regulations vary across the region, and this chart shows these differences in shades of orange, with the darker shades representing more permissive policies. They range from allowing ADUs as of right to subjecting them to occupancy restrictions and public hearings. And gray represents the 17% of single-family land that prohibits ADUs entirely. Representing the largest share on the diagram, 45% of land allows ADUs, but subjects them to certain occupancy restrictions. These restrictions can include requiring the owner to live on the property, prohibiting rentals, or limiting who can occupy the unit, such as only relatives, employees, or elderly tenants. ADUs being permitted without occupancy restrictions comes in at 33%. Broken down by county again, you can see that Cumberland County has the most permissive regulations, with ADUs permitted with no occupancy restrictions at 40%. This is followed by York at 30%. Sagadahoc's allowance is just 13%, though all 3 counties have significant percentages of land that permits ADUs with restrictions. And finally, parking mandates. Across the region, over 3/4 of residentially zoned land, 77% in fact, requires off-street parking for new homes. This map highlights where housing can be built without parking, which is shown in both light and dark purple. As you can see on the map, residential parking requirements vary greatly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Portland, along with a few other jurisdictions such as Windham, Bodenham, and Limerick, have no parking requirements. On the other hand, 100% of residential land has a minimum parking requirement in places like South Portland, Bath, Berwick, and most other jurisdictions. While parking might seem like a minor concern, it's a costly use of valuable land that could otherwise be used for housing and other community needs. I'll pass it back to Coral now.
Thank you, Jeff. I'd now like to introduce a tool provided by the NZA called Zoning Snapshots. A zoning snapshot is a visual statistical summary of any jurisdiction, county, metro micropolitan area, or state published to the NZA. We'll now show how they look. Here you see snapshots for South Portland, Maine, and Cumberland County, Maine. With zoning snapshots, you can easily review and compare key zoning statistics across jurisdictions. For example, note how the one-family minimum lot size of 80,000 plus square feet changes significantly from South Portland at 4% to Cumberland County at 35%. You can generate your own zoning snapshots by going to zoningatlas.org/snapshots. Or if you're exploring the atlas itself and have a jurisdiction selected, you can scroll down from the map to access buttons that take you to the snapshots. I'll pass it back to Sarah now.
Great. Thank you so much for all of that information. The zoning snapshots are a really powerful tool, and I encourage folks to visit. Even while we are on this call, feel free to check them out. I see a couple questions in the Q&A, so keep them coming as I present the last part of our 5-part presentation, which is just a few brief illustrations of the National Zoning Atlas in action. So how might you guys use the Zoning Atlas? Next slide. We have always said that we use National Zoning Atlas data in 3 different ways. So the first way is advocacy. We also use it in analysis, and we have used it in research as well. And we've put on this particular slide examples from each. Over the last legislative session in Texas, just as one example, we did a zoning impact analysis for a Senate bill that was proposed. And what we did was we used our data in Texas. Again, as I said, it wasn't totally complete, but we used the zoning data that we had collected with regard to manufactured housing. And we were able to tell legislators exactly which communities in our data set would be affected by the proposed bill, Texas Senate Bill 785, that would have allowed more manufactured housing and mobile homes to be built through a statewide override of local zoning. Using that analysis, the Texas Manufactured Housing Association and others were able to convince legislators that this pro-housing bill was important, and the bill passed. But we've also helped local advocates understand their own zoning codes, and we continue to inform statewide legislators anytime they reach out to us. So if we do have any folks who are involved in state government or local planning commissions, we certainly encourage you to reach out to us, and we can help you understand the map a little bit better, and maybe some tips and tricks behind the scenes as well. On the analysis side, I think one of our best reports so far has been the zoning report that we did for the full state of Colorado. Unlike Maine, where we've only scratched the surface of analysis in the state, we've actually mapped Colorado in full. That zoning report presented some pretty eye-opening findings, including really significantly large minimum lot sizes, lots of places across the state that banned multifamily housing, even missing middle housing. And the report was delivered in a political context, which involved state legislators, local officials, and many others really debating the importance of zoning and the feasibility and type of reforms that might happen at the state and local level. And we know that this report has been picked up by the governor and others who use it, as well as the Atlas, to inform their own analysis of land use conditions in the state. We hope that once we finish Maine, we'll be able to do a report just like this. On the research side, we've had a number of research collaborations with other entities, including the Urban Institute. The screenshot here is a co-authored report that the Regional Plan Association spearheaded. It's called Averting Crisis, and it uses National Zoning Atlas data in New York City and Westchester County and in Long Island to ascertain the zoned capacity in those areas and to understand the amount of housing and the amount of zone capacity that will be subject to sea level rise. So if we are zoning for new development, if we are zoning for housing in particular in areas that are prone to sea level rise and may not be even livable in future years, that's something that's really important to know. So that's what that Regional Plan Association report does. It calculates zone capacity, and it says, well, where else should we be zoning for more density to enable not only housing the population that already exists, but the population that is to come in these extremely popular areas. So just to give you an example of, all of those different types of applications of the Zoning Atlas, there's a lot more on our website. So zoningatlas.org, if you haven't visited it already. Definitely follow us on social media. You can always reach out to us by email if you have a specific question. We're always happy to get updates to local codes and any corrections that you have as well, because we know we are doing our best with the information that we have available, but at the same time, we know that there are a lot of experts out there. And so if you are one of those and you'd like to help us enhance the information on our map, we certainly invite for you to do that. It looks like we have a few minutes for questions. And so I'll invite Jeff and Coral to come back on screen. And actually, the first question is about updates. So here's a question, and maybe I'll ask Jeff to answer this one, which is, do you reflect the changes in state statute from laws, I think 2003 and 1829, for example? It looks like this is state law allows ADUs anywhere a single family home is allowed statewide. So Jeff, when you were logging local text, did you look at the state statute or did you look at local text?
When we were looking at local text, so we are logging what the jurisdiction says their zoning regulations allow for. So it's possible that is out of compliance with state law. That wouldn't be the first time we've come across a situation like that. I'm currently working in California, which has maybe some similar types of statewide laws, and we sometimes don't see those reflected in the local jurisdiction zoning regulations. We do make a note of that if we're aware of it, that the local jurisdiction seems to be out of compliance with state regulation, but we are logging what the jurisdiction puts out there as its public regulation.
And I think, as Jeff said, this is exactly right, which is we are logging local texts. And what we saw in Colorado as well was a slow compliance with or lack of compliance with some of the statewide laws that are in effect there. Just to give you an example of a state that is actively overseeing a zoning code reform. So just south of you in Massachusetts, the MBTA Communities Act required local governments to update their zoning to allow for a reasonable district around transit stations. So jurisdictions there actually have to report to the state and get approval by a certain time that they have updated their zoning codes to comply. We have seen in Massachusetts jurisdictions that are slow to comply, that don't provide information about their updates, and that may or may not have really succeeded in complying with the spirit of the law. So we are working closely with the state as those updates come in and are reported and are approved. Again, when we look at Colorado, we do see some discrepancies there. As Jeff said, he's seeing some out in California. I think that one of the really interesting things about our map is to show the disconnect between what state legislators say should be happening and what is actually happening at the local levels. Because we know that just by virtue of working with a lot of these towns across the country, the staff often enforces the zoning code that they have on the books. They're not necessarily as fully up to date on the state issues. Sometimes they are. Sometimes a property owner will know and bring it to their attention. But it is a really slow process and there are discrepancies. I see
Can I
Tracy.
add something to that conversation before we move on?
Sure.
Yeah, I just want to say that for I think a lot of folks that are participating in this or watching this webinar too, we know that there is extensive work being done on the state level right now to help bring communities into compliance, both with LD 2003 and LD 1829. MOCA, the new office that was created recently of planning for the state, is working hard to connect with communities. So we're hopeful that moving forward in future iterations of the map, we can reflect those changes. But just want to be clear that it's not so much as an issue of communities not complying as much as it is we're rolling it out right now.
Thank you. So another question, based on your work in Maine and other New England states, do you have recommendations on other states Maine should look to for zoning improvements to allow more affordable and missing middle housing? And so for that, I mean, Jeff, Coral, feel free to weigh in here, but we've certainly seen big changes in Massachusetts. Connecticut's legislature and the governor just signed in special session a bill on zoning reform worth looking at. One of the great things of that bill is that it lifted minimum parking mandates. So you saw that one slide that we had on parking mandates at a residential level, commercial level. Those are things that studies have shown have added to the cost of development, have made development more uncertain, have reduced the number of housing units that may be built on any particular parcel. That may be some additional low-hanging fruit for Maine. So we have information about recent reforms on our website. So anywhere that we have done significant work, and I'll drop in the chat maybe, or maybe Diana can drop as a reply to your question. We have a state resources page, and you can actually click on any of those pages and look in the resources section and check out what's happening in the states. Colorado, by the way, is also not New England, but also doing a lot on zoning reform. Looks like we have a question or a comment about maybe putting a disclaimer on the website that it doesn't include statewide mandates. I do think that's a really, it's interesting. It might be something that we end up putting on we have a little tooltip, little eyes that appear when you hover over certain aspects in the legend. We also, behind the scenes, have been logging statewide mandates, and we're going through the alphabet. So we're deep in California and Colorado right now. But we now created in our editor a back-end way for us to log which fields in the local zoning map statewide rules have started to override. And so we may actually in the future have a tool where you can toggle between what's in the local text and what state mandates actually say. Stay tuned for that. That's going to take some months to build out, but it's an interesting idea that maybe we just be more open about the fact that it doesn't include statewide laws. Coral, I wonder if you might say a little bit more about some of the challenges that you face with regard to GIS, having worked in multiple states. We gave a couple of images in the presentation. And how would you suggest that people, that local governments, and we gave a couple of suggestions in the presentation, but what would be the most impactful thing for you as a GIS analyst to have a better handle on what communities mean when they adopt these maps, the form of the maps? There might be some folks out there who need some tips on how they might present their maps to the public.
Sure, that's a great question. Map design has a lot of important facets to it. I think at a very high level, you could start with what is the product we're putting out there. Static PDFs were kind of the go-to for the longest time, and now you see more interactive GIS maps. Both have a significant place in the world of interpreting the codes. I think the biggest thing that I notice, and I know that we've noticed as an organization, is our map to text discrepancies. I think no matter what format a jurisdiction chooses, there is sometimes through no particular fault, just a disconnect between the person creating the map and the people who may have written the code. So there is an opportunity to kind of go side by side like we're doing and just say, is what's on the map in the code, and vice versa? Is everything accounted for? Is it clear for the average person to understand? As far as colors, shapes, and patterns, I think that anything that can be distinct and clearly indicated is the best way to go. I think anytime your work is going to be reproduced, you want to think about how it may be reproduced and what challenges to interpretation may happen. Notes are always helpful. If you're representing data in two different sources, you may want to clearly indicate we have our overlays on a separate map. Perhaps we have our historical districts on another map. Perhaps we have our airport on yet another. And so I think all of these best practices are, most helpfully viewed through the lens of the average person who just may want to understand what can be built in their community.
Thank you so much, Coral. And I think, as we continue to do work in Maine and as we continue to build out our map nationally, we'll hope to send out or create a document that might allow for local governments to consider some of the best practices we've seen. For us, when it's easy and straightforward, our job is a lot easier. When it's complex, our job gets a lot harder. And we have done a lot of consultation in Maine as we've analyzed the geographies there. perhaps more so than any other state, but maybe California. And again, Jeff, working in California right now, can probably attest to this. We hope that as you continue to look at our map and as we continue to update it and build it out, that things get a little easier. And maybe this is the start of a really important conversation within the state to keep moving in that direction. As Coral said, at a minimum for the average person to be able to understand their zoning code, which, as I said at the top of the presentation, is part of our mission. So with that, I'm going to close the meeting and really appreciate everybody's time and look forward to doing this again when we get a little bit further along in Maine. Thanks again to our partners and to Tara and Diana for working behind the scenes to make this presentation possible.